Hello and Happy New Year. Today is January 1st, 2023, and it's Stuff You Didn't Know. In this case, we're returning to the book of Acts. So we've been doing stuff you didn't know about the birth stories of Jesus. But now as we start the new year, I want to continue and finish up stuff you didn't know about the book of Acts. And we are in chapter 18. Chapter 18, Paul comes to Corinth. So he's on his second, what we call his second missionary journey. By the way, Acts doesn't call it his second missionary journey. The idea of three missionary journeys is an interpretation of the book of Acts. It's very common. It's not crazy. But his first missionary journey is to Cyprus and Galatia. His second missionary journey is primarily spent in in Greece. He jumps the Bosphorus to Philippi, then Thessalonica, then Berea, then Athens, and then here in Acts 18, he makes his way to Corinth. Corinth was a large city. It was a famous city. It had a history that goes back into Greek mythology. You might remember Oedipus. I believe Oedipus grows up in Corinth, if I remember correctly. Corinth was kind of a sin city. I think of your port town where people are coming in and people are going out, and you can easily not take responsibility for what you do there because you can come and go. It was at a very narrow isthmus. I can't say that word. An isthmus. It was only, I think it was only 4 miles across at its narrowest point. And so rather than, take your ship all the way around the south of Greece, around the Peloponnese, rough waters, sometimes bad sailing, you could actually take a smaller boat and put it on, I think it was called the Dialkos, and I have a commentary on 1st and 2nd Corinthians if you're interested with Wesleyan Publishing House. Anyway, that's not important right now. Eventually, I'll do explanatory notes on 1st Corinthians. That's one of my goals for this year. But anyway, back to Acts. You could put your small boat on a kind of a trolley and push it across that narrow isthmus. Of course, there's a canal there now, and then put it back in the Adriatic Sea on the other side and go on to Rome or something like that. If it was a large ship, you could simply unload it, carry it over, and put it on another ship over there. So people are going through Corinth. And whenever you have that kind of coming and going, and people don't know your name, where nobody knows your name, you can get by with stuff. There was a famous temple of Aphrodite here with hundreds of prostitutes. Now, this I should clarify that temple was destroyed. Corinth was destroyed. I think it was 150s, somewhere. I forget exactly when. I don't have a photographic memory. But 140s, Memmius, I think it was, a Roman general, destroyed Corinth. And so the stuff you read about how horrible Corinth was technically comes from an earlier phase of Corinth's existence. But I think it's fair to say that Corinth probably had its share of being, prostitution, things like this. It had its probably fair share of vices available to those who wanted them. We generally think that it was from Corinth that Paul wrote 1st Thessalonians, and maybe 2nd Thessalonians too. Acts says that Silas and Timothy come back from Thessalonica while Paul's at Corinth. So Paul goes to Athens, goes on to Corinth, and then Silas and Timothy come back. 1st Thessalonians gives a slightly different impression of just Timothy going back to Thessalonica. Anyway, little details, nothing to worry about. But Paul wrote 1st Thessalonians, which I think is the first book of the New Testament to be written from Corinth. So it's hard for us to get into that paradigm shift to realize that there was not a single page of the New Testament written at this point. We're in Acts 18. We're in the year probably 50 or 51, and not a single page of the New Testament is written yet. Now, of course, some think Galatians was already written, but I go with 1st Thessalonians. So Paul writes he doesn't know it, but he writes the first letter of the New Testament, the first book of the New Testament from here in Corinth, and he sends it back to Thessalonica. We meet in Acts 18 Priscilla and Aquila. They are fellow tent makers. Paul's trade is he makes leather goods. Now, I have a feeling that when he's back home in Cilicia, when he's back in Tarsus, probably his dad owns the company, because he complains about, I worked with my own hands in 1 Corinthians 4. I worked for you, as if that's a strange thing. You get that impression. But he's willing to surrender his pride for the gospel, and he is a tent maker. And so what he does is, as we know, we've seen this, he goes to a city, he goes to the synagogue and preaches to Jews there, and then he sets up a tent making station in the marketplace, and he preaches to Gentiles there, probably. Priscilla and Aquila are fellow tent makers, and they join him in this mission. Interesting to note that Priscilla is often mentioned before Aquila. You get the impression that Priscilla wears the spiritual pants in this family. And of course, Luke, one of his emphases is the role of women. And so Priscilla is a very strong testimony to the leadership roles and the spiritual leadership roles that women took in the early church. And so Priscilla and Aquila are there in Corinth. And they'll be in Ephesus a little bit later. Next week, Lord willing, I'm not going to go through all of Acts 18. I think probably the chapter division is wrong at the end of chapter 18, so I'll finish chapter 18, Lord willing, next Sunday, and we'll hear about how Priscilla and Aquila help disciple Apollos. What's this? A woman discipling a man? How can it be? Well, apparently the book of Acts has no problem whatsoever with it. So Priscilla and Aquila are fellow tent makers, and they join Paul in the mission. Why are they there? We have testimony here, and of course we read about it in, I think it's Suetonius, a Roman historian. We read about the expulsion of the Jews from Rome by Claudius. Now, there were a lot of Jews in Rome, so probably it's primarily the Christian Jews who are expelled from Rome. Apparently, there was so much controversy in the synagogues in Rome about whether Jesus was the Messiah or not, that the Romans took notice. It got that bad in the conflict. And so we have to believe that Priscilla and Aquila were probably prominent preachers of the gospel in Rome. And of course, Paul's not been there. I don't believe Peter's been to Rome yet at this point. That's a legend that I think develops later. And so Christianity had come to Rome organically. No disciple, as far as I know, none of the key disciples had brought Christianity to Rome. It had gotten there by word of mouth. Apparently, God can get the word of God out there without important people. Where are your credentials? Apparently, God's not too worried about a person's credentials. That's the whole idea of a prophet. Prophets don't go to prophet school. The Holy Spirit gives them their credentials. But we have evidence of this expulsion of the Jews by Claudius and witness to the existence of Jesus. There are some crazy people who think that Jesus didn't really exist, that he's a legend, but like Hercules or something like that. But we have evidence from secular historians, including this event here where Suetonius talks about arguments over Christus, which is probably a reference to Christ. Paul has the same strategy, goes to Jews first. When they kick him out, he goes to Gentiles. But I will say that Paul seems to continue to have interaction with Jews in the mainstream synagogue here in Corinth. And so we're going to hear some names that are familiar in this chapter. Titius Justus is not a familiar name from the rest of the New Testament, but he is a prominent player in the synagogue in Corinth. This might be, I wonder if this is a guy named Gaius. We hear about Gaius both in 1 Corinthians 1 and also in Romans 16. It would seem that the church at Corinth met in the house of Gaius when everybody met together, so this must be a fairly wealthy person. Titius Justus is a Roman name, which suggests that he has a Roman citizenship, that he has Roman status. This is a elite kind of person who believes in Jesus and apparently hosts the church at Corinth in his house, if it's Gaius. We hear of Crispus, synagogue ruler. We hear about two synagogue rulers in chapter 18. One is named Crispus, and then later on we'll hear about Sosthenes. And synagogue rulers did not it wasn't a permanent office. They rotate. I think it was on a yearly basis, if I remember correctly. And so Crispus, at the beginning of the first year of Paul's stay at Corinth, Crispus is the synagogue ruler. And the second year of Paul's stay at Corinth, Sosthenes is the synagogue ruler. That's the way I'm reading, or at least hypothesizing it goes here. We do hear about Crispus and Gaius in 1 Corinthians 1. Paul is upset at the Corinthians because they're worrying about, well, I was baptized by Paul. Well, I was baptized by Apollos, and all this kind of, saying I'm better than you because of who baptized me. And Paul says, I'm glad I didn't baptize hardly any of you. I baptized Crispus and Gaius. I remember that, but man, baptism is not the key thing. Of course, it's the Holy Spirit inside us that makes us a Christian, not whether or not we've been baptized or not. But we will hear of this Crispus again when we read 1 Corinthians. Baptism, as I said, was an issue at Corinth. Who did it? And Paul says, this is crazy. Is Christ divided? Was Paul crucified for you? We are one in the bond of love. Anyway, year and a half or 2 years, Paul stays there at Corinth. He's getting better, right? He doesn't get kicked out as soon this time. Now, of course, Acts doesn't tell us he got kicked out. But I do wonder if the meeting of Paul before Gallio did facilitate his departure. Acts doesn't say that. And of course, Luke is emphasizing the fact that everything was done decently in order and peace-lovingly in the early church. So I'm not sure that I think probably Luke wants to give a positive impression both of Gallio and of Paul's interaction with Gallio. Well, who is this Gallio? Gallio is the Roman proconsul who comes to, I think it was a proconsul who comes. There were several different kinds of roles you could have, but he comes to Corinth. Paul appears before him. By the way, we have external attestation of Gallio's existence. We can pinpoint Gallio's time in Corinth. He was only there a year because he got sick, as I recall. But from around the year 50 to 51 is when Gallio was in Corinth. This is the fixed point of Paul's chronology. As scholars try to figure out the timeline of Paul's ministry, this is the starting point where Gallio is there in Corinth. So we know that Paul probably took him about a year to get there. And then Paul was, therefore, the Jerusalem Council was probably around the year 49. And then he talks about after 14 years, he went up to Jerusalem. So if you subtract that, what do you get? You get 5-ish. The years were, part of a year could count as a year. So I generally think of Paul as having gone back to Tarsus around 36, which means if he was 3 years in Damascus and Galatia, that Paul would have become a Christian about 33. Sorry, that's a lot. But so this is the fixed point of Paul's chronology, and we move, of course, forward from here. That if he then was writing Romans in the late 50s, maybe 58, maybe he's arrested in Jerusalem around 58, and then around the year 60, Festus becomes proconsul. Anyway, 62, he's in Rome. It's hard. But we don't know for sure, but it's interesting for some of us. So we meet Sosthenes at the end of the chapter, synagogue ruler. He is with Paul in 1 Corinthians 1:1, Paul and Sosthenes, the brother. I don't think that Sosthenes probably had a lot to do with the writing of 1 Corinthians, but I do wonder if Sosthenes helped take 1 Corinthians back to Corinth, and that maybe Sosthenes was the one who read the letter of 1 Corinthians to the Corinthians. So Sosthenes we will encounter again in the book of 1 Corinthians. Paul leaves Corinth after his appearance. We get the impression there was some time between his appearance before Gallio and him leaving. He goes down to Cenchrea, which is the port city. I believe Corinth had 2 port cities, the one on the east and one on the west. Cenchrea was the one on the east. We see Cenchrea mentioned again in Romans 16:1 because this is where Phoebe is from. Phoebe the deacon, not the deaconess. It's the masculine form of the word deacon. Phoebe the deacon. Again, a clear indicator that women played leadership roles in the early church. And so Phoebe was from Cenchrea, one of the port cities of Corinth. Paul takes a vow, cuts his hair. We get the impression in these last chapters of Acts that Paul participated in the life of the temple, and that he visits the temple. And this is important for some of my own scholarly work, because I think that we as Christians are so used to the book of Hebrews, and we're so used to the idea that when Christ came, there was no need for a temple, that we don't realize that it may have taken them a little bit of time to figure this out. I frankly don't think the early Christians expected the temple to be destroyed, even though Jesus anticipated that. But anyway, that's for another day, perhaps. So Paul takes a vow, cuts his hair. He makes a quick visit to Ephesus, leaves Priscilla and Aquila there, which finishes the second missionary. He goes to Jerusalem and then up to Antioch. All the missionary journeys begin from Antioch. And so the first missionary journey began from Antioch. The second missionary journey began from Antioch. And then next week, we will see the beginning of the third missionary journey as he begins. And he goes back through Galatia. But if he spends 2 years in Corinth on his second missionary journey, he will spend 3 years at Ephesus on his third missionary journey. And we'll hear more about that next week on Through the Bible, and also stuff you didn't know about the book of Acts.